Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody back. I have heard from folks who are in each of the three panels. It looks like they all went superbly, and we now have lots of data churning up, and we've got even more with a fabulous panel coming up. I just want to mention a few things to you. And let me take a moment and walk the rest of the day with you. This session is what we call an Agora session. It's designed to have conversation with the panelists and then very much with you. From now on through the rest of the day, we're hoping that your expertise and knowledge and experience can really contribute to a conversation. We are not exactly sure where we're going to wind up, but you may be, or you may have thoughts about it, and that will be all to the good. So keeping your eye on the rest of the day that way. We call this session The Changing Political Landscape is Philanthropy Keeping Up? And there will be lots of points of view on this one. At its conclusion, we're going to adjourn for lunch and we'll have an hour, and I promise you there will be no speeches. This is just a moment in time when you guys can all sit with the folks that you know and haven't seen for a while, or have seen for a while, and enjoy a conversation. Right after lunch, we'll have what may be a forward-looking moment. The people who are going to speak with us are people who know the philanthropy world, but who don't come from the philanthropy world. So they've had their different experiences, and they will have very important and somewhat different cuts into the conversation than we've had previously, and more on this later. So finally, about the mechanics of this, the discussion is being live streamed, so people can get it that way. But the broadcast itself will end when the Q&A starts. Please do not tweet. We will hold on that for now. Okay, so my primary task then is to introduce Gara, who is a senior fellow at Berkeley now, as well as senior fellow at NYU. He covers both coasts, and he does it beautifully. Gara, as you probably know, was CEO of the Atlantic Foundations, and before that of OSI, the domestic side of OSI. Early in his career was a Texan, but that's gone now. I think happily so. And Gara has become one of the most significant spokespeople for social justice, the importance of human rights, and all those issues that dovetail into it. So this is my pleasure to introduce Gara. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I sometimes wonder if somebody came, time traveler came from 50 years ago to one of these conferences, they would find a lot familiar, but they would be scratching their heads at the don't tweet during the conference thing. That would be a little odd to them. And I worked for 4 years as director of the Texas Civil Liberties Union, and it was the most fun I've ever had in any job, actually. So you can't, I'm not a Texan by birth, but I am kind of an adopted Texan. So this panel, what do we call it? Changing political landscape is philanthropy keeping up. It's meant to build on everything we've done so far and set the stage for the rest. And let me first begin by talking about the people who are up here with me. On my immediate left is Donna Edwards, who is a member of Congress representing the 4th Congressional District, which is portions of Prince George's and Anne Arundel counties. She's been a member of Congress since the 110th Congress, when she was elected in a special election, and took her first full-time seat in 2009. She has, among other things in her congressional career, become the first member of Congress, of the House, to introduce and champion a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Before she served in Congress, she had wide experience in the nonprofit and the philanthropic world. She was the executive director of the Arca Foundation, which I had cause to mention this morning as one of the partners of Atlantic after your day in the healthcare debate. She was the executive director of the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Center for New Democracy. She graduated from Wake Forest University and got her JD from the University of New Hampshire School of Law, which I want to say for those of you who are playing along at home, was once called the Franklin Pierce School of Law. And there's no doubt, I think, that this is the only conference in the United States in the last 10 years where Franklin Pierce was mentioned twice in plenary sessions. Bill Schambra is the director of the Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. For 10 years, he served as director of programs at the Bradley Foundation and was a senior advisor-in-chief speechwriter for a number of people, including Edward Meese as Attorney General and Louis Sullivan as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. President Reagan appointed him to the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, and President George W. Bush to the Corporation for National Community Services Board. He writes extensively on philanthropy and civil revitalization and civil society in all kinds of places, including regularly in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Finally, Heather McGhee is the Vice President of Policy and Outreach at DEMOS, a public policy organization working to give everybody an equal say in the democracy and an equal chance in the economy. She writes and speaks frequently on issues of democratic reform and economic opportunity on MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN, so you have the whole kind of spectrum covered. She co-chaired a task force in 2009 within Americans for Financial Reform that helped shape key provisions of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. And she has a BA from Yale and a JD from the University of California at Berkeley. So a terrific group with which to talk about the things we're meant to talk about in the next half hour or hour or so. I want to say just at the beginning, before I frame it a little bit and ask some questions of the panelists. Sorry, this is my little cheat sheet about the really exciting technological aspect of this, which is that we're going to have some instant kind of polling, very, very high-tech thing, which is kind of the opposite of Franklin Pierce, which is that you all have, Franklin Pierce, we may have been high-tech for his day, but I don't think Franklin Pierce would be texting. So anyway, when we're finished with the initial part of the discussion, you all have, or many of you have, smartphones, cell phones, and so on. There'll be something, there's a sheet on your table that shows how you access this. You're going to, if you wish to, I'm going to ask a question. You're going to put in a certain number that'll send this thing to some central database that will instantly tally the answers, so we can have just a sense of the room on a couple of little questions about philanthropy that might help to focus the remaining part of the Agora-Style discussion. And Beta Jahedi from Philanthropy New York is going to come up here and make sure it all works, and there will be people floating about the audience helping you with the technological aspects of this if you find it daunting. So let me just get into the substance of it here. The premise of this larger panel, we just came out of some really interesting workshops on health, equity, poverty, education. This is about the broader picture, and that is, as Stan Katz noted this morning, the issues about the role of foundations in the public sphere are not new. They've been, not to say raging, but going on for 100 years or so, in some ways more intensely 100 years ago when the kind of paradigmatic early foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Russell Sage took the scene. So in that sense, it's nothing new. But one of the questions we want to ask is there something about the current environment that has created a context in which philanthropy has to step back a little bit and look at its role in the public sphere? And what I mean by that is a couple of things about the context. Increasing political polarization. The health care panel this morning, this came up. I suspect it probably did at the others as well. And that is, we're living in a moment in American life where, to a greater degree than anybody remembers for a while, and one question is this unusual, permanent, cyclical, and we can get into that, but we're in a moment of enormous political polarization where it's argued that some of the tried and true strategies of foundations for affecting public policy, among other things, trying to forge a bipartisan consensus on certain issues, don't really work that well anymore in an environment so polarized. We have the rise of the mega foundations, which occupy a role, and maybe even more so than Rockefeller and Carnegie did 100 years ago when they had the field to themselves. You have very large foundations like Gates and a few others that have huge roles, concentrated roles in public policy. Stan Katz mentioned some of the dimensions of that this morning when he was talking about the Broad Foundation and New Jersey politics, or the Rockefeller Foundation's foray into New York City mayoral politics recently. And one of the questions is these big players are increasingly dominant in some areas like education and health. What does that mean for philanthropy as a whole? What does that mean for the polity, as it were, as an exercise of power in a democratic society? Back to politics for a moment, you have a lot of aspects that make government increasingly dysfunctional that aren't necessarily about polarization as such, but that have to do with gerrymandering that draws legislatures in a way that very often office holders feel no particular sense of the common good because they are elected by a fairly narrow constituency that doesn't give them any points for reaching out and trying to solve big national problems. You have issues such as the filibuster, which makes at least one of the chambers in the United States Congress often somewhat dysfunctional. And you have changes, as Catherine Fulton mentioned, in the health panel that I was just in the nature of how influence is exercised, and that is about the media environment, the 24/7 media environment. It's about the differing role of facts in public debate. I think there's a premise that animates a lot of philanthropic work that if only people knew the facts, if only they were more educated, then something would change. And it may be that if it ever was sufficient, is no longer sufficient. So what do you need to build on that? And maybe foundations have to rethink a little bit their approach on some of these issues. So that's the setting in which we want to have a conversation both among ourselves and with these three terrific panelists here. So I'm going to ask a few particular questions of the panelists, invite them to comment on one another's. We're going to do that for the next 15 or 20 minutes. And then we will segue into a larger conversation because, again, one of the operating premises of this gathering is that this room is full of talent and expertise, and we ought to have a larger conversation that isn't just one way. And we will do that as soon as we possibly can. So, Representative Edwards, I want to ask you the first question because you have worked kind of both sides of the fence, as it were, in the policy realm. You were the head of a foundation. You were the head of various NGOs that tried to influence policy. You were the targeter, if you were, of the political sphere. Now you are, among other things, the target of this kind of advocacy. And I wanted to ask you, how you saw things or whether you saw things differently for having moved from one side to the other.
You put so much out there, Gara. Let me just say, first, when I ran the National Network to End Domestic Violence, I worked on a set of issues that, for the most part, at the time, were not particularly political or polarizing, and in fact had, because of the advocacy work around the country, garnered a lot of support among Republicans and Democrats. Now, those same set of issues today are largely viewed as democratic policy options, very sort of ingrained in the Democratic Party, and the Republicans as opposition to that. That's both surprising to me and saddens me too. But I think it is a sign of the kind of times that you just illustrated. Now, when I was in philanthropy at the Arca Foundation, number one, by the time I got to Congress, looking back, I think we thought that we were more than what we are. And I think, thinking back to my days as the executive director there and working with our board and working with various organizations, I think that we believed that the organizations and institutions that we were funding, the work that they were doing, the partnerships that we had with others in philanthropy, had a lot deeper impact than being on the inside, I now believe to be true. And so that gives me a little bit of pause. I mean, part of that, though, from the inside now in Congress, I think that that there needs to be more of an impact from the outside into Congress, that too many of us as members rely on each other for our information. We don't rely as much as we should on people outside of our institution for information, for guidance, for policy direction. And I don't think that's particularly helpful to decision making, and I don't think it's helpful to governing. It is still true, though, that you have a lot of organizations that are viewed as sort of organizations that influence the Democratic Party, and you have organizations and institutions that influence the Republican Party, and never the twain shall meet. And unfortunately, for people who are working on issues, I don't think that's a good thing. And for communities, I don't think that's a good thing. And so to the extent that philanthropy begins to examine what it does from a public policy perspective, I think it would be good to get out of that box. And it's so that all of us inside the institution believe that we stand something to lose by not being on the side of whatever those set of issues are.
It resonates with me, your point about how I think what you're saying about Arca is that when you're in a foundation, you tend to have a foundation-centric view of the world, whether you're a large foundation or a small foundation. So I used to joke that when I was at Atlantic and OSF, it was like that Roz Chast cartoon in the New Yorker where the middle-aged person is reading the obituary page, and they look at the headlines and they read it and it says 2 years older than you, 3 years younger than you, and so on. So you kind of tend to look at it with yourself in mind. Same is true with the way a foundation executive reads a newspaper. So it is a little, and the more removed you get from it, the more you can kind of see, right? And so, but nevertheless, taking that point, what do you see, therefore, as either as a specific example or generally, ways in which foundations could be acting that would have more appropriate impact on the political process?
Well, I do think that I believed this when I was at Arca as well, that foundations could actually act more collectively. I think there's too much sort of hit or miss, thousand flowers blooming. A foundation comes up with an idea, finds an organization that's going to run with that idea, and then boom, they're out there. And I don't think that that's really helpful to governing, and I don't think it's helpful to policy making. And so to the extent that that philanthropy, both large and small, can figure out ways to partner, then it actually forces those kind of partnerships among the various organizations and institutions who work on those issues, because it becomes very confusing as a policymaker. Where I'll give an example. So now we're in this huge debate about what to do around entitlements, and everybody recognizes that we have a driver in healthcare costs that are sending both Medicare and Medicaid expenses like this. But then the question becomes sort of what you do. And even on my side of the aisle, we are getting so many different mixed signals from various organizations and institutions about what would be a good policy fix for something that we could probably all agree is a problem. And philanthropy is funding each one of those threads. Philanthropy, and then there's the other stuff that's not philanthropy. It's labor institutions, business institutions, and the rest. And so there's not a reason. I can always find an ally for my idea. And so there's no reason for me not to just stay where I am on a policy alternative, because I can always find some organization and institution and set of philanthropists who are funding that who will go along with me. Again, I don't think that's really helpful to governing. And we could see some of that play out in healthcare, and we can certainly see it in a whole other set of issues.
Let me move to Bill. Bill Schambra and I have known each other, I don't know, for 10 or 15 years or so, been in a lot of panels together, don't agree much on some large political issues, but actually have very similar worldviews about philanthropy. And so I've always felt an affinity. A little-known fact is that if I had not gone to Atlantic Philanthropies, I was going to take my sabbatical from OSF as a fellow at the Bradley Center, the Hudson Institute, and see how the other half lived. But that has not yet come to pass. So what I want to ask Bill about, because I know that he may be skeptical of even some of the premises of this question, but I want to start out by asking, since you had all this time on the ground, as it were, at Bradley and then more recently at Hudson, is there a difference in the way conservative and liberal foundations and feel free to question the premise of that as well, the way conservative liberal foundations approach policy work. Obviously, they disagree to a great extent about tax policy or education policy, healthcare, all kinds of things. But in the way they go about their interventions, and Bradley I always think of as a foundation that was a model for, in many ways, in the voucher issue and things like that. Is there a difference in the way they approach it?
Well, yeah, there is a profound difference. First, I should say I really envy your sticker. I wish I had a battle ribbon that said "token conservative." There, I feel better. I will not strip myself of my speaker token. Well, I mean, it's entirely appropriate, incidentally, that I should be the token conservative because, quite frankly, philanthropy as a field is by and large, as Stan Katz reminded us this morning, is by and large a field dominated by the progressive understanding of public policy, which is that you apply expertise to a problem and solve it from the top down, that you figure it out scientifically, intellectually, get to the root causes of it, and solve the problem once and for all through the application of social science. That was the model for philanthropy. It wasn't called progressive philanthropy. It was just philanthropy. It's just what philanthropy
did. It was the progressive
did.
era, maybe not accidentally.
Yeah, and it was more or less what was happening throughout institutional philanthropy for a very long time. It was, the moment of reckoning came when conservative philanthropy sort of arose, actually, probably out of an incident right here in New York City, the Ocean Hill-Brownsville dispute, when the Ford Foundation decided to try and experiment with the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school district, and out of that experience, it's hard to remember, but the neoconservative intellectuals who were based here in New York City saw firsthand the damaging effect of this, and they concluded that there's an enormous amount of hubris embedded in this progressive model. The notion that you can solve problems by importing solutions from the outside. And so they reformulated a philanthropy that was an effort to kind of get behind the progressive model, to return to what they understood to be the founders' understanding of the Constitution, to a more vigorous role for civil society, a more vigorous role for faith-based institutions, and a model that was a critique of this, professional top-down reform. And the work that Bradley did in Milwaukee was based on the notion that the experts had failed at school reform. By and large, all the efforts from school district headquarters had failed, and it was time to let the parents try. So it was an effort to radically decentralize decision-making in education and to return it to parents themselves. It's a long-term, patient effort. I think what Gara likes about conservative grant-making is that it takes the long view. It's very patient, because it has to be. There are so few conservative foundations in the United States that it has to understand itself as a very embattled minority. You can disagree with that, but that is how it understands itself. And therefore it's patient. It makes grants that are for general operating support. It sticks with, it has a well-formulated vision of what it wants to achieve, but at the same time, it really does rely on feet on the ground to carry out that mission.
But I'm not sure, listening to you, that I see quite the sharp differences in the approach of philanthropy. Because, for instance, I don't know that much about Ford and the gray areas and all that stuff that led to Ocean Hill-Brownsville. And you may very well be right that the kind of concepts were cooked up in think tanks or elite institutions, although as I understood, the premise of it was to provide power at a local level. So when you talk about Bradley and vouchers, maybe I'm wrong that parents didn't design. I mean, it seems to me that the policy initiative was probably cooked up in some kind of elite institution, no? And then the delivery system was about, power at a small level. But I'm not. It doesn't strike me as being that, unless there's something I don't understand about the process, that different than the way so-called progressive foundations would go about it?
Well, it's different in the sense that the school voucher approach, as I say, empowers parents to make whatever decision they choose to make, and that it is entirely up to the parents to choose what education approach they think is appropriate for their child. If you stick with purely public, the purely public system, you end up with a one-size-fits-all approach. And that a lot of parents in Milwaukee and elsewhere indicated that didn't work for them. So they sent their children to schools that I'm sure the experts would never have chosen for them. A great many of them faith-based institutions, Catholic schools, Lutherans, Clara Muhammad, a Muslim institution. I mean, a great many schools benefited from that, and more importantly, the parents benefited from that because they finally had the power to make this critical decision in the lives of their children, which is something that other foundations typically tend not to do. Granted, it was helpful, obviously, to have a substantial amount of money involved in the change, but if the parents themselves hadn't wanted it, it would never have prevailed. It has now not only survived Republican and Democratic administrations alike and fierce assaults by the teachers' unions, I might add, but it's actually been expanded considerably. And if the parents themselves weren't behind that, it simply wouldn't have happened.
Let me ask you just one other question before I turn to Heather, and that is one of the other things I've always kind of liked about conservative philanthropy, and I've talked with you and Jim Pearson and others over the years, is a less of an obsession with a certain kind of metrics than the progressive foundations have. So I don't know if you stayed with the Bradley Initiative long enough to assess the results of it. And it may be, if your basic premise is that parents should have the choice, it's not that important how the kids are doing in school. I mean, in other words, if it's about parental choice, maybe it doesn't make much difference. But what did Bradley, if you can address it, do to see whether or not that initiative was working?
Yeah. Bradley was fully willing to fund all sorts of evaluations, as were other foundations. Everyone here we can have an hour and a half argument about the results of those evaluations. It's both sides in that issue can cite their own tests, as the Congresswoman was mentioning. But the fact of the matter is, parents make those choices for all sorts of reasons other than test scores. I mean, they make the choices based on a kind of a moral vision for their child, perpetuating their own cultural traditions, whether the child is safe or not, whether this is a fairly strict environment or a lax environment. All these calculations that parents make about what their child needs, you can make in the choice system, and they aren't reflected in evaluations. But in general, yes, conservative foundations are not big metrics people because, frankly, for this world, there is only the long haul. I mean, there's the people who started the first foundations on the conservative side thought they were losing the war. They were fighting a losing battle. They were in retreat. Many people would say that's exactly where they are today. And I understand the president one of his aides has said that the next major speech the president is going to give will provide a golden bridge for quiet retreat for conservatives. So maybe this is now coming about. But they always understood themselves as being embattled. And so the notion of metrics and measurement and careful analysis of progress really was beside the point.
You want to understand the mentality of embattlement. You want to be an ACLU member in Lubbock, Texas. Conservatives have nothing on that. So, Heather McGhee, So demos, among other things that it does, but one of the key issues it's identified with, and you've worked a lot on, have to do with the very health of the democracy. And some of the things I was talking about at the beginning, whether it's the role of money in politics or some of the structural issues that we've been talking about that contribute, many would say, to a certain kind of dysfunction in the politics. So foundations, Donna Edwards was, if I recall correctly, the co-chair or the chair of the Funders Committee for Civic Participation, which is an affinity group in the Council of Foundations that was working for democratic reform issues. And it is still a very important group. But by and large, these issues have not been a significant turf for foundations. And what would you say both generally about the set of structural issues about democracy that give rise to this conversation, and what foundations are doing or could be doing to affect that agenda?
Thank you. So you're right, Gara. The issue of how it is that the political and public will is translated into effective policy, is translated into the structures that can help build opportunity and protect the common good and invest in the future is sort of at the core of the way that Demos does its work. And so for years, and I'll say before it was as attractive as it is now, we've been working on really wonky issues of election administration, with the goal of really lowering the barriers to civic participation. And I think some of the things that we need to keep in mind as we think about the world that philanthropy operates in and the world that we are seeing right now, particularly in Washington and state houses, is that there is a class gap in voting, that there is a class gap in donations, obviously, and there's a racial gap, and there's an age gap, and there are geographic disparities as well. And all of that translates into, particularly at a time of such rampant economic inequality, a degree of political inequality that our founders, that we like to think our founders would never have tolerated. And I think that's one of those great things where we just sort of import into, from the words of the founders, something, a higher ideal that we are still always perfecting, and that our many amendments to the Constitution have really put forward that we can finally reach a time where we have a democracy that is kind of unique in the globe. A democracy where we have roots of people who've come from all over the country, roots of people who have different races and different incomes, but who all theoretically have an equal say in shaping the decisions that affect their lives. But we have a long way to go for that right now. And fortunately, I think honestly, a lot of it has to do with two really upsetting moments in our democracy over the past 3 years. One was the Citizens United decision, which obviously was just building on a long history of conservative jurisprudence around the First Amendment and regulation of campaign finance, but woke the American people up to what was going on campaign finance, and is one of the most popular names of a Supreme Court case ever. We have a public opinion analysis on our website where we actually called it Citizens Actually United, because across the ideological spectrum, the American people are just apoplectic about the principles of Citizens United, about the idea that corporations should have unfettered access to our policymakers and to shaping elections. And they absolutely believe that the wealthy and corporations have too much power in policymaking, and they feel shut out of the process. And then the other part has to do with that shutting out of the process, which is that we saw with the very, finally a lot of media attention to the kinds of laws that have been threatened and have been passed for a very long time to make it harder for people to vote, and particularly with disproportionate impacts among people with less money. And so we are now seeing, I think, among philanthropy and among civil society, and frankly among the part of civil society that aren't the democracy nerds, that aren't the good governance groups, but that have real skin in the game on core issues like healthcare and the environment and workers' rights, an incredible amount of attention to these structural issues. And when we think about the kinds of reforms that are very popular, in many cases in a bipartisan way, these are things like same-day registration, which is something we've been working on for quite some time, where it just removes the onerous barrier that 30 days before an election I have to have registered, that something that election clerks love because it cuts down on provisional ballots, something that was rejected handily, the repeal of that in Minnesota and in Maine. where we can look at things like extending early voting, places like New York that don't have early voting. Or we can look at a lot more sort of technical issues, but that just simply make it easier for people to translate their will to vote into actually voting. We know that there are 60 million Americans who are not registered to vote, and that once Americans are registered to vote, they vote at very high numbers, above 80%. And so that registration is a key barrier that we can actually attack. And then on the money and politics side, we do know that there are a lot of opportunities to make some real change that would affect the feeling that Americans have that donors matter more than voters. And here in New York, there's an opportunity for this to be the first state to pass citizen-funded elections after Citizens United, and that's something that's very much in the sort of political debate right now, and that a lot of philanthropists have seen as a way to really translate this moment of what do we do about our democracy into legislative action. And I will say that I actually agree with you, Gara, that there is something appropriate about philanthropy being focused on democracy issues. Because, and maybe this is something that even you might agree with, the idea of being able to put ourselves as advocates out of business because our democracy is functioning in such a way that people are able to organize on their own behalf, that people who are struggling to make ends meet are actually having a responsive government, is a really exciting one. That is, talk about long term. That is very long term. That is very far from the place where we are right now, whereas we know there's great political science research that's been done. It's all actually mostly collected in a report that we are about to release, but there are copies here called Stack Deck that really look at all the different ways that money correlates with political power. And Larry Bartels found that the bottom third of the income distribution has no apparent impact on the decisions of their elected officials. That's where we are today, and there are structural changes that can change
So
that.
it seems to me, in part, you're making an argument that, if I hear you correctly, that there are foundations like Carnegie or Arca or others that have been more traditionally focused on democracy as a kind of a substantive area, but that foundations that don't think of themselves in that space, that might be concerned with health or education or other issues, ought to take a wider lens, and because the things they care about are deeply affected by this.
Yes, I mean, I think that that is something that a lot of people are coming to, that foundations are coming to, that organizations that have never worked on democracy issues are coming to, is seeing really these democracy blocks, that the substantive goals that they have for environmental change, environmental activism, for women's rights, for anything basically that isn't sort of on the sort of top 10 list of the groups of lobbyists that are the most influential in Washington, is not going to be heard unless there are these changes to the structure. And ideally, I think there's a little more that needs to be done to sort of create a sense of political efficacy among people, civic engagement, really dealing with racial disparities and with the difficulty that Americans have in really seeing themselves as one people, which I think is something that philanthropy should really look at very much in the face. But ideally, with these structural blocks out of the way, and I'm talking about 10, 20, 30 years here down the line, we should be able to have a more responsive government.
Well, I will resist the temptation to have, we could take the whole hour and a half to maybe debate Citizens United or vouchers or things like that, but I do want to give you, I'm curious, Bill, about whether you think there's anything in this agenda that some conservative foundations do embrace or might embrace, or do you have a different view in the structural democracy set of
no,
questions?
I think that conservative foundations theoretically have a deep commitment to civil society. I mean, the refrain is, once government is pushed back, the boundaries of government are pushed back, civil society will step in, which is another way of saying citizens will take more responsibility for their lives. And I think there is some agreement about that. Now, by that, obviously, folks on the left tend to mean more a kind of an activist agenda. folks on the right would mean more sort of tending to their own affairs for themselves, but there's an enormous amount of overlap. I mean, obviously, organizations don't do entirely one thing or the other. If they're effective organizations, they do both. So I think theoretically conservatives could, in fact, find some grounds for agreement there. Unfortunately, they tend to have become much more political, by and large, and following, in their mind, the path of a lot of progressive foundations in moving ever closer to sort of pure politics. I mean, I think lurking behind the issue here is a recent development in philanthropy, and that is the degree to which our foundations have been politicized. Our C4s have pressed ever closer to the line of outright electoral engagement. C3s have become, they're allegedly producing research, but it's opposition research. I mean, it's research, it's ammunition for political campaigns. And as I say, I think this is, everyone says that, well, that's the Koch brothers, of course. Well, come on. When this happens on the left, as it does all the time and in much greater amounts, no one seems to notice it. But the fact of the matter is, it is going on, and it does raise this question. Do donors, now I know you mean by donors wealthy corporations, campaign donors, but let's broaden the understanding of donors a bit. Why should foundations be able to exercise this amount of influence in our politics and our policy, especially as they move ever closer to the line of outright engagement? And I think that's a place where we need to, everyone in this room really needs to think about that problem.
Well, you've anticipated the two other questions I was going to put on the table before we widen it up. And I just want to say parenthetically, I was working for George Soros when, in 2004, I wasn't working for him in this capacity, but on the foundation side. In 2004, he made his significant foray into electoral politics, and a lot of people noticed. Glenn Beck certainly noticed. So I'm not sure I can agree with you that it went unnoticed. And maybe it's tit for tat, and that's what the Adelsons and the Kochs of the world are doing. But in that, so both these questions, which have to do with, on the one hand, donors who've been traditionally philanthropically oriented, like George Soros. I know his mentality on this a little bit. He was never interested in politics. He had a whole set of goals in the world, foreign policy issues he was concerned about, and also a set of domestic issues. And he came to feel in 2003, 2004, that the administration of George Bush was a threat to all the things he cared about, and that if he spent some of his post-tax money on the electoral side, he might accomplish a lot of good. I can't speak for him. As the years have gone by, I think he's lost some interest in political donations, in the political process. But that's the way he felt at the time. And so it's seductive, isn't it, to want to get into the political sphere. That seems to be what has drawn some of the more conservative donors into it as well. In a way, Bill, it's kind of set against the long-term view that you articulated, right? That, building ideas and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, we know people on the progressive side are highly attuned to the threat of big money in the electoral context. I mean, and I wonder how they feel about it in the more normal philanthropic context. So the first thing I want to say is that what do you think there's a danger of big money? Is there a way of looking at this? Is tricky, I know, because you raise money from foundations, and
I'll say it.
You say it.
Okay,
Is that a danger, Don?
No offense, but just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean your idea is great. And even when I worked at Arca, the chair of our board, I mean, and he died a couple of years ago, but really tremendous man. And occasionally he'd come up with an idea and then want to go find an organization that would work on that idea, and it would be a wacky idea. Nobody should work on that. And so I think that there can be the tendency that just because you have money and can drive it, that the issue or the idea that you care the most about, you should be the one to then determine that policy outcome. And I think that there has to be an exercise of a bit of responsibility on the part of those who are either large individual donors or institutional donors to resist the urge to just make the policy outcome. Or to define the policy outcome, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great policy, even though there might be a ton of money behind that. I think it becomes hard to do, and I do think that there is a line between policy and politics, and I actually value philanthropy that really does focus on development of public policy, and whether that policy is on the left or the right. I mean, I'm going to argue for the left every time, but almost. But that doesn't matter. We're just not in an environment, frankly, that is very receptive to truly independent sort of public policy development. We're going through probably about 30 years of beating up on every kind of institution that we know, whether those are institutions of government, state, local, and federal level, and other institutions. As a result, there's a great distrust that's developed in the public sphere, trusting any information or any set of facts. I think philanthropy ought to be very concerned about that. I sit on our serve on our Science and Technology Committee, and I'm shocked sometimes at I come from a background, I was a systems engineer on a space lab project for NASA. I actually do believe in, science and technology, and yet I sit on a committee where very ideas of basic scientific fact and information are challenged constantly. This is not a good environment for us because those things, whether it's in the science sphere or it's in other areas, keeps us from developing sane and appropriate public policy. And so I think those are things that philanthropy could spend a little bit of time on. In democracy issues, I never understood why it is that you care about, if you care about education or health care or early childhood development or nutrition and all of those things that have huge public policy implications, you should care about democracy, because people like me don't really, sort of get to hear any of that information because the politics and the money get in the way of it. And then lastly, I would say, just on an electoral side, I'm also chairing our campaign committee's recruitment. And so I've been looking around the country at candidates prospectively who could run in various different districts. Number one, it is true, the districts are so highly gerrymandered that it just makes it really insane. But the other thing that's true is that people who are of modest means, who are really good, smart, talented people, and whether those folks come from the left or the right or any place in between, have very little capacity to run for and hold elective office in this country under the system that we have. That cannot be good for any of us, whether you are engaged in philanthropy, impacting public policy, or you're a lawmaker trying to enact public policy.
You should highlight that NASA engineer thing in your bio. That's really cool. If I'd known that, I would have made it part of the introduction. Yes, it is. It's not rocket science, yeah. So, let me ask you all, though. So if, as Representative Edwards says, having a lot of money doesn't give you necessarily good ideas, and we're, as I say, highly attuned in the political sphere to being skeptical about people, the Sheldon Adelsons or whatever, throwing their weight around. And if we should be also bring that sensibility to the Gateses of the world, who are with tax-exempt dollars influencing policy in a big way, and I may agree with everything they do, but that doesn't necessarily change the basic point. Is there a remedy for that is not worse than the disease? In other words, how do you bring about more philanthropic accountability to the communities that they serve? Bill?
Well, you're right. Any legal remedy that one could think of would be worse than the disease. What this sector needs is a free and open discourse about the consequences of philanthropic activity, and it absolutely lacks that. As was pointed out earlier, there are no beat reporters any longer. There used to be one in the New York Times. There isn't one anymore doing beat reporting on philanthropy. And I don't mean investigative reporting on exposing scandals. I mean, as Stephanie Strom did on occasion, remember that big initiative that was rolled out a year ago? Well, it's a year later now. Let's just take a look at how did that go? We don't have that. The power of the foundations is such, and that goes back to a quote that we heard from Stanley Katz. I mean, you know, the power of the foundations is such that open and free discourse about their strengths and weaknesses is almost completely absent. And I think we desperately need, that's one of the good things this conference is doing, is actually raising that question and you know, facing the big issues. It's one thing, you know, everyone can applaud this vigorous involvement in public policy, but, you know, given our emphasis on effectiveness and outcomes, and let's just get it done, why not just say, look, you guys, you elect this mayor and you keep him in office and you get my grant, you know, and if you don't, then you don't get my grant. I mean, how much more effective and immediate of an outcome can you get than that? That's perfect. So anyway, but we need a vigorous press around that issue. Rick Cohen from NPQ is here. Glad to see him here because he's one of the very few who's willing to take on these big questions.
But Bill, I mean, I do think that there's a role that whether you're an individual philanthropist, wealthy person with, you know, ideas about how to change the world, or you're an institutional philanthropist, you can play the role of convening and convening disparate points of view that actually end up coming up with good solutions. And so there's a role that those folks can play, and even pushing an idea but subjecting it to some level of critique that isn't just your own just because you have money.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree that you need a more vigorous press. I think if philanthropy had to look over its shoulder a bit, like politicians do, or business, or sports, or other sectors, they might feel differently. And it's hard because there's always this bite the hand that feeds you thing. I'm talking with a publisher about a book on democracy and philanthropy, in which I expect to be very critical, as I was from within, about philanthropy. And I said, you know, by the end of the year, I might be in a different job. And if I'm, you know, in philanthropy, I'd be happy to write the book. But if I'm raising money, I'd like to write a book about how smart rich people are.
That book's been written by this gentleman right here.
Yes, exactly right. So anyway, all right. Now we're going to segue into the interactive portion. Before we, first of all, think about your questions, and shortly I'll ask you to line up with the mic as we open it up. Now. If I understand this correctly, you should whip out your cell phones. I'm going to ask you a question. First, you're going to put in the number, like as if you're dialing. Mm-hmm. Vita will help me. 22333. I'm supposed to read the thing backwards from here, so I'm not so good on the numbers, but it's 22333. Now, there are 4 questions, and the first 2 I would say are in the kind of Goldilocks category. Foundations overall in their policy work are either too timid, too involved, or just about right. So I think the numbers are on the screen, right? So I don't have to, I'll repeat them, but 231530 if you think foundations overall are too timid. 231537 if you think they're too involved. And if you just think it's just about right, 231538. And you're seeing things,
Yeah, so far we have 89% saying too timid and 11% saying just about right. And we have now 86% saying too timid, 5% too involved, and 10% just about.
How big is the electorate?
20 people so far, so keep trying.
All right. Are they still coming in, or shall I go to the next thing?
They're coming in. We're at 27 now.
All right.
78% too timid, 16% too involved, and 6% just about right.
All right.
We're at 31.
Okay. I think we have a trend. Okay. Now, I'm going to now I want to say, for those of you who are running foundations or in foundations, this question is about my foundation in policy work. So I want you to. This is anonymous. We're not going to, we're not mining this data. If you think my foundation is too timid, 231539. If you think my foundation, not mine but yours, is too involved, 231540. And if you think your foundation has just got it absolutely right, 231543. Right, exactly. A second thought, I wonder about the wisdom of this question, but I invented it. So. How's that going? It's on the screen. Oh, I see. 21% say their foundation is too timid. 69%. This is akin to the question you always get in polls about you know, do you think Congress is awful? And 98% they found that your congressman is fine, though, right? You know, so, all right. So somehow or another, there's a disconnect between the notion that the field as a whole is, or maybe it's just a self-selecting group. So, okay. Finally, 2 more questions, and then I want you, if you have a question for the group, in fact, now would be a good time, a comment or a question, to begin lining up at the mics. Big reason foundations don't do policy work. I'm going to give you 4, and you can choose one, although there may be multiple truths here. Board is reluctant, 231-544. Scared about regulators, 231-577. Ignorance of strategies and rules, 231-582. Staff not skilled in those areas, 231-597. So this is why foundations, if they don't do enough work, and most of you seem to think foundations as a rule are too timid, why don't they do it? What are some of the key reasons? Beta, I can't really read that, so you tell us how the votes are coming.
Okay, board reluctant is 52%, scared about regulators, 16%, ignorance of strategies or rules, 32%, and staff not skilled in those areas, 9%. The pool is 43. People are getting more quick about texting.
Okay, well, they're getting the hang of it now.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Got to do something about those boards, I think. So, and finally, one issue foundations should step up more on is, and this is a longer list, if you think it's climate change, this is, obviously there are multiple answers to this too, but take the one you think is the most important that foundations should be doing more on. Climate change, 143252. Deficit and spending, 235100. Poverty, 235101. Education reform, 235123. Immigration, 235124. Women's rights, 235142. Gun violence, 235143. Democracy issues, 235146, and other 235154. We're getting both, huh?
Yeah,
Okay. How many responded so far?
34.
34. Okay, why don't you start
Okay.
to say what they.
So we have 11% for climate change, 3% for deficit and spending, 23% for poverty, 5% education reform, 5% immigration, just turned 7%, 2% for women's rights, 7% for gun violence, and 38% for democracy issues, 5% for other.
Well, I judge from that Heather is a very effective advocate. I'm tempted to add a 5th question, which is how much more money are you going to put into democracy? But we don't have the technology for that. Okay, so we're going out to the group. There's only one person at the mic, but anybody else who has something on their mind should pop up.